Yes. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whoever listen to us anywhere. This is the session or a workshop on Human Security Index in Africa. This panel is co-convened by UNECA as well as the Policy Center. This is a partnership project. I would like to emphasize and highlight that it's a partnership project that is trying to advocate and champion the issue of Human Security Index. The Human Security Index, just to give a little bit of background, the human security approach was first introduced in 1994 when the Human Development Report was conceived and further elaborated upon final report of the Commission on Human Security. In 2012, the General Assembly adopted a common position or definition of the concept of human security through Resolution 66-90 that stressed the role of the member states in identifying and addressing widespread and cross-cutting challenges to the survival, livelihood, and dignity of their people. In other words, threats to and values under threat, people's life are the critical starting point of human security approach. The approach calls for people-centered, comprehensive, context-specific, prevention-oriented responses that strengthen the protection and empowerment of all people. Arising from the information gap and the lack of appropriate tools for measuring human security in Africa, the Economic Commission for Africa, in collaboration with the United Nations Office of the African Union, the UN Human Security Trust Fund, including, and the Policy Center for the South, has the mandate through a member state resolution to take a technical lead in developing an African Human Security Index. This is just as of background, what the definition, the history, and whatnot. So what's the objective? What do we want to do? Our goal is basically to enhance the understanding of the application of human security approach and its usage as a tool for developing effective policies and programs by government, NGOs, as well as regional and sub-regional intergovernmental institutions toward the achievement of Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. Two, to develop the African Security Index as a universal yet contextual relevant tool to guide policy development and monitor progress across the nexus of socioeconomic development, good governance, human rights, peace and stability towards Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. We are aiming to pilot the index originally in 5 countries, then measure and evaluate its utility, its effectiveness, and present it to the African Union before it's rolling it out to the whole member states. Then we make recommendations on how the African Union Commission and the member states of the AU can most effectively apply the index to advance Agenda 2063 and SDG and highlight this recommendation in different global and regional forums. In short, the mandate is human security has been incorporated into the key UN policy documents, such as Millennium Declaration and subsequent agenda into Millennium Agenda, integration into long-term regional and national development strategies. Similarly, the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, the UN Secretary General's report on larger freedom and subsequent reports on human security, 2010-2012, and then the Development Human Security Framework and African Human Security Index falls within the mandate of the UN-AU Joint Framework for Enhanced Partnership in Peace and Security. The framework guides close coordination and cooperation between AU and the UN agencies. To conclude, I would like just to say UNECA is aspiring to align this initiative, firmly with its partners like the Policy Center and others in basically designing high quality and relevant analytical and policy tool. Today, we have in this panel 4 panelists, Sarah Mugaddam and Saad Badri and Eleanor. Among the 3 of them, they will present both quantitative and qualitative approach on designing the index. And to start with, we will have Sarah to really talk about the theory of human security as well as framing this project for our audience. Over to you, Sarah.
External threats to states. So the field of security studies has developed beyond this traditional focus where threat is seen as essentially emanating from a hostile external environment to some modern understanding of security that is considering the multiple threats that may not be war-related, but that have a great potential on individuals and that can undermine every aspect of human life. The traditional notion of national security was broadened to encompass more factors that are already affecting people on a large scale around the world. So in 1994, as you mentioned, Jalal, the Human Development Report emphasized the need for another profound transition in thinking from nuclear security to human security. And so this shift from the traditional approach to human security approach is really focusing on going beyond the state's ability to defend itself against external threats and looking at and having a more people-centered approach. So looking at going away from security of the state to the legitimate concerns of ordinary people in their daily lives. The concept of human security approaches security from the point of human life. So questions of marginalization, deprivation, exclusion were put forward, encouraging the consideration of non-military security threats such as the spread of disease. 2 days ago we discussed the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on security in Africa, and we see that we don't need a global war or a localized act of violence to destabilize the whole international system and impact countries no matter how far they are from the epicenter of the disease. Besides about the dynamics between environmental degradation and scarcity and its effects on instability and violence. Overpopulation, mass refugee movements. So basically the human security approach focuses on threats and conditions to people's security that are normally seen as, not normally seen as threats to the state. For most people, a feeling of insecurity arises from worries about daily lives. So securing human beings is about safety and protection. And the human security approach not only looks at the threats, but also the mitigating routes and the protection mechanisms that are put in place to respond to these threats. So from the threat of disease, hunger, and employment, we have all listed them, and then we will also look at the dimensions that have been proposed for the human security approach. At the analytical level, the notion of human security is based on three fundamental freedoms. So the Human Security Handbook has also schematized kind of these sorts of freedoms to actually show how they're interlinked. So we have the freedom from fear, which really looks at the threats to the safety of people, all forms of violence that can affect people's well-being and people's life, and freedom from want, which is the threat to the basic needs of people, freedom to live in dignity, and this is the threat to human rights. And this is why, I mean, the modern understanding of security through the prism of human freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity emphasizes the security, development, peace/human rights nexus. So, I mean, we look at the broad definition of human security. I mean, when the United Nations Development Programme formally coined the concept of human security in 1994, it was widely accepted as a humanist alternative, shifting the discourse away from the traditional state-centric orientation to the protection and advancement of individuals within societies. The UNDP's 1994 report offered an introduction of how people-centric concepts of human security should not replace the traditional, but complement and broaden and deepen our understanding of security. Basically, it does not challenge state security or traditional approach. It rather strengthens the relationship between state and the security of the people. I mean, how do we define human security? Human securities, I will go back so we can have a look at the dimensions that were developed for human security or the threats. Various definitions have been offered to really define human security. But the UNDP's report put forward a multidimensional conceptualization of human security that is aimed at providing a holistic approach to help pinpoint the greatest areas of individual vulnerability. So the broad definition identifies two main aspects. In the first place, it means, and I'm quoting from the UNDP's report, safety from chronic threats as hunger, disease, and repression. And there is a second dimension, that is, it means protection from sudden and hurtful disruptions in the pattern of daily life. So chronic threats as well as any disruptions that can affect people's life. Human security, as I said, does not only look at the threats, but it looks at the mitigating routes and the mechanisms put in place to respond to the existing insecurities. Human security has been incorporated in many UN documents. I mean, some have been already cited in the introductory remarks. The UN Millennium Declaration, the Millennium Agenda as well. I mean, it's been fully integrated into long-term regional and national development strategies. It has also guided foreign policies of countries. I'm citing, for instance, Canada and Japan as well, who are leading two, let's say, two distinct schools or approaches to the concept of human security. And it is also one of the, it is the founding goal for, or founding objective of the Sustainable Development Goal. It has also been highlighted through the UN Secretary General reports on larger freedom and subsequent reports on human security in 2010, 2012. And at the African level, in 2013, a high-level committee of heads of states and governments have put forward the Common Africa position on the post-2015 development agenda. I mean, the Common African position addressed poverty eradication by 2030 as an ultimate goal for the continent, and has called for continental structural transformation that is people-centered. So the Common African position was adopted by the countries of the African Union at the 2014 summit. In 2013, there is also a highlight, which is the TICAD summit or conference. I mean, the fifth TICAD and the African Union, where the African Union has reaffirmed the centrality of human security as a framework for assisting African countries in achieving their development goals. We will look at the 7 dimensions of human security. So human security has also challenged and also drew practices from human development. Human development proponents argue that economic growth is insufficient to expand people's choice or capabilities. Areas such as health, education, technology, the environment, and employment should not be neglected. Human security springs from a growing consensus that these two fields need to be fully integrated in order to enhance security. So human security also further enlarges the scope for examining the root causes of underdevelopment, of insecurity, by seeking to bridge the divide between development and security objectives. So the lack of human security has adverse consequences on economic growth and therefore development. And here again comes the nexus between security, development, and human rights. So the UNDP's 1994 Human Development Report's definition of human security disaggregated the concept into 7 interlinked composite parts: economic security, food security, health security, environmental security, personal security, political and community security. We'll look at some of the propositions that were made on the Africa Human Security Index position notes on how we can possibly find, what are the possible indicators for measurements of the 7 dimensions of human security. It's an exhaustive list. As we see, one of the strengths of the human security approach is that it's very broad. This is one strength, but it's also one limitation. And for our project, the main question is: are we following one approach that kind of fits all, or do we have to look at African specificities, regional specificities, when looking at the indicators that we should be taking into account? Basically, we should be very constructively. We should constructively inform and discuss how we map and measure people's living condition, and through what categories, so that they can reflect what we have discussed in our meeting to launch this project in Addis Ababa in March this year, is do we have to talk about some regional specificities, continental, and really try to reflect them in the African Human Securities Index building. What are the fundamental sources of insecurity, of human insecurity in Africa? This is a question also to our audience. You are invited to share with us what you feel is mainly the main cause of insecurity, and if you can also probably specify which region or country you come from, mentioning what is for you the main source of insecurity. Depending on countries, within countries, depending on regions and cities, we can find different answers. And there is a notion that we should be taking into account when considering human insecurity in Africa, is the domestic level and also the global level when addressing this issue. In the case of Africa, most issues are seen as being domestic and internal, while they might actually be a consequence from external dynamics or international dynamics. Jalal has discussed this point during the March meeting, and I would like also to cite some of the examples of the effects from globalization and from the international system on African countries. If I can recall, you mentioned the case of the SAPs and how these adjustment policies and the neoliberal reforms in the post-1990s have actually opened new fault lines between state and society in Africa, and how it might have triggered some instability, insecurity in African states. Also the impact from removing subsidies from various productive sectors has unleashed a wave of threat to human life. So this is a point that should be taken into consideration on this interaction between external dynamics and internal dynamics. I would like also to cite an author, Chusodowski, who has written in 1999 a very interesting study reviewing the root causes or adding new dimensions to instability in Rwanda in the 1990s. For Chusodowski, he actually presents, he refers to the Rwandan genocide of 1994 as an economic genocide. That it has been the consequences of it has been the consequence of an economic genocide that has started in the 1980s with the deterioration that has followed in the wake of the collapse of the international coffee market in 1987, and the imposition of the IMF World Bank reforms that has inflamed ethnic tensions and accelerated the processes of not only economic but also social collapse. There are also other examples during the two last panels yesterday and the day before of these APSACO talks. Speakers have discussed the effects of COVID-19 on the continents. It's how through globalizations now diseases are spreading from one continent to the other and now affecting and disrupting the global production chains, the global economy, and definitely the human security of people around the world. And mostly in areas where there are already deprivations and marginalization. In yesterday's panel also, one of the speakers has discussed the threats of terrorism in the Sahel, and he has also called to look at factors that are probably environmental, and look at how they interact with increased violence, how it leads to increased violence in the region, how it pushes people to move and then creates tensions between communities, so the forced migrations due to environment. I would also like to recall another element in East Africa when we discuss, I mean, we've been talking through last years of the increased militarization around the Red Sea. How does it really translate into, I mean, how does it translate into our into a population's well-being in the region? How does it affect them on a daily basis? So how do we move the concept of human security from concept to actually to practice? A variety of prominent and well-established global indices which link to different dimensions of how human security has been delineated since the 1994 Human Development Report, have served as tool and reference points for benchmarking some aspects of human security. These are typically centered either on states' capacity to provide an environment that is conducive to human security, or how well the degree of development in different countries and regions fosters improvement in human capabilities. So while mapping the patterns and trends of human insecurity around the globe, has played a key role in the wider discourse on humanitarian governance in the international arena, measuring threats to human security and human vulnerability has thus far been characterized by a lack of specific global human security index. Any attempt at identifying threats to human security first risks the identification of who is vulnerable and to what. Some experts, citing a study by Hastings, disaggregated human security components, with each component consisting of several indicators. I mean, I will go back to this table. So, each of the indicator will have to be assessed by a qualitative team to understand its local relevance, its relation to human security itself, and look at the variable that needs to be measured and how it is measured, and the real condition that these indicators portray. It's also important to look at interlinkages between different indicators. The process of translating the notion of human security into concrete measures relies on two important first steps. So the first step is to disaggregate the concept of human security into distinct categories and indicators that can enable a comprehensive and clear representation of its complexity. The second is to assess human security indicators in light of the reality on the ground. Developing a human security index, it requires not only the quantification of these components, but also the qualitative verification, validation of these quantitative data to assess their relevance. So the Human Security Handbook presented an example on, it's a case study on Kenya, on the central Turkana, where the region, is highly affected by a climate change migration situation, where recurring drought cycles have led to increasing movement of pastoralists within Kenya or across the border in search of water and pasture for livestock. This case study really provides us with very interesting practical practical demonstration of threats to human security was a promising effort to make the idea analytically useful and to allow for measuring human security with the available indicators. But there are limitations to consider. The first one is about the definition of human security. A key prerequisite for mapping the state of human security is the availability of a clear set of guidelines on what precisely the 7 categories of human security contain, and what are the major signposts or threshold for insecurity in each. So each of the components of the human security operationalization, So, and we should overcome this limitation. I'm just giving one example. Food security is defined as the physical and economic access to basic food. This implicitly combines 2 distinct factors. The first, on the other hand, the access to the assets, employment and income to buy food. So therefore, the degree of food security overlapping with the economic security is to take into consideration. I mean, a great deal of ambiguity remains over the relationship that the 7 core components, or at least how to handle this relationship between these components can be managed. The second limitation is a data limitation. I mean, it's been widely cited as the main obstacle, but I think since the 1990s, we can say that, I mean, we have more data and we have access to more data. The matter now is to look at what are the available indicators. I think in the project we have ruled out for now, and also given the current context, the possibility of going for groundwork. So, I mean, collection, I mean, first-hand collection. So we'll be using available data sources. So the question is, how often are they refreshed? And also, is it a responsive, responsive or, I mean, approach that we are building this index? And in this case, how can we also use early warning systems in the index fabric? How can it inform us, and how can it actually help build an index that can provide policymakers with the ability to quickly respond to insecurities? Another point is a gender focus. I mean, it is quite crucial to measure human security and in the measure of human security to be sensitive to gender. I'm citing a robust body of evidence and work that has been done by Caprioli in 2005, whose analysis have shown that increased domestic gender equity has a pacifying effect on communities. And that states with the higher level of gender equality are less likely to resort to violence, first in resolving international disputes. Her study was further supported by other findings that have demonstrated that societies with higher female representation in parliament and higher female to male education attainment ratios have lower levels of internal conflicts. So these are this is a consideration to be made for when looking at our indicators. And finally, I mean. One unique approach also to African Human Security Index engaged the private sector in human security and in defining human security. So, I mean, at this point, I think I will leave my colleagues to provide some answers to these limitations, and especially on the data collection front and the quantitative aspects of the dimensions. Thank you, Jalal.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. We already have almost 3 more questions. I should give you about 15 minutes. I should be able to.
Okay, let me just share my screen. So I'm going to talk about sort of the approaches and options we have for actually developing this index. I'm going to sort of bridge between Sarah, who was talking about the more of the theory behind human security, and Sad, who's going to talk about more about the data. And I'm sort of going to discuss how we get from sort of A to B and the processes we're going through as a team and in discussion with experts and also people like yourselves. Yeah, so I'm going to discuss sort of where we started, where we are now, where we want to get to, and how we plan to get there, and then Saad will take over with more detail on that. So this is sort of a map of the current landscape of indexes, or indices. I think we all know that there are a lot of indices out there measuring a range of different things: political, education, health, environment. But they're all very separate, and that gives a lot of it's almost confusing for policymakers to have to look at that many number of things. And I think sort of there's been a development, as it were. Sort of we 50 years ago we were just looking at GDP and looking at very monetary values as a way of measuring progress. And then we sort of developed into Human Development Index and looking at incorporating health and education into measuring progress. And I think now the landscape has moved again to focus, as Sarah was mentioning, more on the person and on individual security. And this sort of brings up the need to create a human security index. And as you can see in this map on the screen, they're trying to develop a human security index globally, but Africa's human security is incorporates different elements than a lot of other places in the world. Sort of things like perhaps water scarcity isn't such an issue perhaps in Europe as it is in Africa. And so there's a need for sort of the prioritization of different elements for nations. And then there are other African indexes, but as you can see, there's the Abraham's Index of African Governance, and there's also the African Sustainable Development Goal Index. But again, this really sort of is some of the old sort of out of date focus of development, more on sort of government and monetary, and less on the actual individuals and the and sort of the human security aspect that Sarah was talking about. So there's a gap and there's a need the new focus on human security aspect of development. And also this has also been strengthened during COVID with changing and focusing on human security, and also the changing perhaps the realization that perhaps Africa is going through some other challenges compared to other regions in the world. And again, this would provide one index that African policymakers can look at and use that's tangible, that's there, rather than all of these different competing indexes. So that's where we started. There's a need for this index, and with that, some of that theory that Sarah was talking about. So we had a workshop in March that was bringing together over 60 subject matter experts from NGOs, from universities, from research organizations, from economic commissions, to discuss sort of how we're going to go about creating this index. So some of the things we were discussing is sort of qualitative v quantitative, and I think there was a consensus that it should be both. That although we are making this as a qualitative index, a quantitative index, sorry, it should be complemented by qualitative assessments of the country, case studies, and so on. The data source, we were looking at like whether it would be possible and feasible to sort of carry out our own data surveys, or if we're using existing sources. And I think given the current climate and the challenges involved with collecting our own data, we agreed to sort of look at the current data that's available. We also discussed what sort of the structure in terms of whether it was going to be a load of different indicators, or if it was going to be, separable into sort of, the 7 pillars indexes. And I think we looked at 7 indices for one for each of the pillars, with 3 to 5 indicators for each, which I think Saad will go on to talk about later. And then we were talking about with the framework, whether we were going to look at like what is our ideal and aim for that, or whether we're going to sort of go from the bottom down of like what is the data that's practically allow us to do. And I think now we've come to an agreement that we're going to do it both ways. We're going to develop our ideal and where we would like to get what our ideal African Human Security Index would look like. We're also going to look from the bottom up with the data that's available, and then carry out a matching process, which I'll come to later on. But our ultimate objective is to create a usable, meaningful, adaptable toolkit for African policymakers that can be transparent and accountable, that will help them to progress and to improve human security, i.e. improve the lives of their citizens. So where are we now? So we've been carrying out some data mining over the last few months, looking at what's out there, what's available. So if you look at this graph on the screen, you can see there's a range of that's one sort of 15 indices that are currently out there, which are made from underlying data. And that is the coverage of African countries. So you can actually see that, I was even quite surprised, around 90% of countries are covered by most of the indexes, which shows that it is possible, there is data out there, and there are indices that are covering countries in Africa that we can use, and we don't to create this one index that will have it all in one place, that will be this toolkit. So that's sort of where we've got to in the process. So where do we want to get to? So we want to create, as I said, the key is the usable, meaningful, adaptable toolkit. So usable, that it is user-friendly, it is easy to understand, both from policymakers' view and as citizens and as NGOs. It's meaningful, i.e. it's actually, this is the Human Security Index is actually having a meaningful impact on the ground. So those, however we end up measuring it, is actually related to the individuals and citizens of the countries, and it's making a difference in their life. If you improve the index, it does improve their lives. And adaptable, and this is so that each nation perhaps they will have different priorities. They will have they can use it to focus on whatever their needs are. For example, there might be some options with ratings. So if a country is more food security is more of an issue, or if the environment is more of an issue, then they can re-rate it to be adaptable for their needs. So yeah, so then the sort of common African perspective, the CAP, to enable government ownership by helping governments to focus on their own context. So we are creating an index to hand to policymakers that they can use in their country. So yeah, so a compilation of smaller indices that can be easily taken apart and analyzed. So we can have for each of the 7 pillars, they can each ministry or each area, subject matter area, they can focus on that particular and improvements for that. Easily related to objectives set out in Agenda 2030 and 2063. So it can be related to those other goals that are internationally on the international scene. So we want to provide a complementary, not confusing tool. So this year, to bring together those variety of indexes that I outlined at the start into one area, one sort of one sort of check-in point that they can easily see, easily use. It can easily be related to everything else, but they don't. It's to complement. It's not to confuse. So how do we get there? How do we achieve this ideal index? So the first bit is to set out developing the ideal framework. So how do we develop the ultimate sort of index? So this is as you can see on the screen here. What I propose we could do is have for each of the 7 pillars. So you have the main risk identified. So for example, for economic, the main risk might be poverty. And then to feed into that risk, I think as Sarah mentioned, right, there's vulnerabilities, or there's what's the word? There are threats. There are threats which make in each country that make this risk more likely. For example, what makes people vulnerable to poverty would be sort of job insecurity, informal sector. And then the other big factor in human security is, are there escape routes? So are there escape routes to poverty? Is there support by the government if you do lose your job? Is there training to help you secure better jobs? So that would be an easy, good way to break it down that I think would be very easily understandable, and also very easy to then improve. And then you can reduce the vulnerabilities, and as a government you can increase the mitigation strategies. So how we develop this, we will be in discussion with the experts that sort of we had at the March workshop, and also in consultation at more conferences like this, to get feedback and responses, to build up what we think this ideal framework would look like, and what we would ultimately like to measure. Some of the other things to discuss is sort of how do we reconcile different national priorities. If we are looking at what the government perhaps sees as the main risk, or if we were trying to focus on the citizens and what sort of disconnect there might be there. There's also discussion on weights, the different weights that we would be used, and if they would be sort of malleable, adaptable according to the context, and how we combine the indicators. So how do we add it up, and sort of, is it equal between all the pillars? Is there more or less, and also how I think, and what Saad will come on to, how we deal with the not the overlaps, the sort of interdependencies, stuff like women, gender that would come across all of them, or things like disability that would also come across multiple aspects, or the environment also that would come into quite a few. So, right, once we have written out this sort of ideal framework, then how do we proceed from that? And Saad will now, that is a catalogue of the data that's currently available, from sources like the World Bank, the UN, the ILL that we want to get to. And then we are sort of doing a matching process in terms of looking at coverage, looking at quality, and making sure it's actually measuring human security on the ground, i.e. it is actually making a difference. You know, it's not something like number of traffic accidents when actually, well, there's no roads, so there can't be traffic accidents, that sort of thing. So that's sort of where we started, and where we want to get to, and how we propose to get there. I now hand over to Saad.
Defining the ecosystem of the methodology, and then the components of the methodology. Then let's to dive into the data-related issue. Let me invite Saad to come to make his own presentation. You have 15 minutes, Saad.
Thank you, Jalal. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Eleanor. So I'll try to fit my presentation in 15 minutes. So you will forgive me if I go over it by a few minutes. So today, the title of my presentation is called The Empirical Challenges of the African Human Security Index Construction. I will start by going over the table of contents. I will start by statistically framing the problem. I will go ahead and talk about how we, in my view, we can construct the index. Then I'll talk about some data challenges, and I will finish with some remark, which I hope will be food for thought for our audience today. So what is the African Human Security Index? So as my colleague nicely framed it, so the African Human Security Index is a multidimensional analytical framework that can assist the UN develop and implement and integrate response to a broad range of complex issues. And the index is composed of 7 dimensions, which are shown here for convenience. From left, we start from the economic security all the way to the political security via environment, personal, and food, and so on. These dimensions, they are by definition complex, and one may wonder whether we can fully reflect all these dimensions in one index, and can we even talk about construction puzzle? However, before getting into the construction, I would like to spend some time, thinking about the problem, framing it. Having the helicopter view about the problem can be very helpful to not only frame it but also anticipate potential issues. So, to frame a statistical problem, we need to think about the desired outcome. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Is it an inference problem? Is it a causality problem? Or maybe is it an early warning system? We're looking to predict some conflict somewhere in Africa. And it turns out any statistical framework has 2 important properties that are important to mention today, which are flexibility and interpretability. To further illustrate my idea, I took this figure from a very famous statistical book written by a professor at Stanford called Element of Statistical Learning. This figure shows on the x-axis the flexibility, which is defined as the number of variables, and the interpretability, which is basically how interpretable the model is. In the middle, you can see a lot of names. These are the names of statistical models. You can ignore them. They're not important for our presentation. However, I would like to draw your attention to the arrow in the middle, which is pointing towards the bottom right. This is basically saying the more the framework is flexible, the more variable it has, the less interpretable it becomes. And vice versa. The less flexible the model is, and the more interpretable it becomes. And it turns out that a lot of statistical framework in economics and social science, they tend to be in the top left, because in economics and social science we're looking to build stories around the data, and of course it's important. And also on the bottom right, we tend to find the kind of algorithmic type of frameworks that tend to be really black box, very hard to interpret. So with this in mind, we understand, we figure out that there is some sort of trade-off between interpretability and flexibility. We can't have them all. We can't have a model that has a lot of variables and at the same time offer a great deal of interpretability. So let us now, kind of revert back to our African Human Security Index. What is it that we want from it? What is the desired outcome of the African Human Security Index? The desired outcome, we're looking for something that is practical, that supports policymakers and practitioners in their decision-making process. And it's therefore important, I would not stress it enough today, it is important to frame it in such a way to break the black box effect and ensure some degree of interpretability. So now that we know this, okay, great, you tell me it's great, so let us see what the index offers. The index has 7 dimensions with 5 variables, which amounts to a total of 35 variables. It is not a lot, but it is not small either. So one may wonder, what kind of statistical framework can we utilize to make the index interpretable, accessible, and practical to the decision makers? So what kind of model can we use? So it turns out the high number of variables, this model is highly used by practitioners because it's simple to use and easy for interpretation. This model is called decision trees. Decision trees are usually used for classification. However, they could be extended to our problem, and I will show you how. They can be extended because they adopt this top-down stratification approach shown as here. So this is a typical tree or decision tree. You can see the blue box on the top is root, which is basically the root problem that we're looking to explain. We divide it into leaf 1 and leaf 2, and we further subdivide leaf 1 and leaf 2 into answer A and answer B. And if need to be, we can further subdivide answer A into further answers. This is basically saying that we can take a complex problem, break it down into pieces, small pieces, until we achieve the desired granularity, and from it the desired clarity. And if actually, if you flip back to the figure I pasted earlier, you will find that the three lie right in the middle of that figure between interpretability and flexibility. This is probably the best alternative we have out there that can basically offer us a great deal of flexibility and clarity. So now that I spent 2-3 minutes talking about the framework, how we can frame the problem and think about it, this helicopter view is for me is very important. Let me talk about the construction. How do we go about constructing the index? To talk about construction, I will transpose this top-down stratification into my African Human Security Index. So here is the African Human Security Index 3 representation. It may look intimidating, but your eyes will quickly get used to it. So in the top, we have the final value. In the middle here, you have the dimension, which I have equally weighted for convenience. And under each dimension, we have the number of variables that we can use, depending whether we use 3 or 5. This picture here give us a great deal of detail. First, the picture here brings out a lot of clarity. That's the first thing. As you can say, it's fairly clear. I would even say it's very clear. 2, we can track the root cause of the final index number, which is the blue box you see on the top. And this is, of course, important. And 3, in one pager, we can have the key information we're looking for. And I don't know about you, but as far as I'm concerned, I do not know many statistical models that can offer you so much clarity in one pager. The second strong point of this tree representation is we can methodically dissect the index into dimension, and hence we can facilitate the apple to apple comparison. For example, Jalal was talking about 5 pilot countries. If we were asked to compare, the index at each dimension level for each country, that would be possible with this 3 representation. The third point, also this clarity kind of break the black box effect, and it also enhances the storytelling, the data, what I call the data-driven narrative. It is important to kind of do the interpretation. And last but not the least, I would like to add that this kind of 3 representation can also serve like a puzzle-like structure, where it can actually pinpoint which variable is missing and which one is available in terms of the data collection. So practically, how do you go about this? So let's focus for now on one dimension about the construction methodology. we can focus for now on the economic security. The same process applies to all other dimensions. So we have the 5 variables shown here for convenience. I'm sorry if it's below, it's not really squared with the screen. So you can see that the 5 variables for each dimension. So first, those 5 dimensions will most likely come at different scales. You know, some dimensions are in square feet, other are in dollars. So it is important to normalize the variables and bring them to a comparable scale. Afterwards, we can take the geometric mean of those variables in order to limit the substitution effect. Substitution effect is very important. It can distort the interpretation, so it is crucial to take care of it right from the start. So once we take the geometric mean of the variable, we feed it back into the framework. We apply the same process in every dimension, and we end up weighting those to come up with the final index number, the one that we see in the top of the blue box. Okay, fine. So we talked about 2 things. We talked about the framework, how we frame the problem. We talked about the construction, how we go about constructing the index. So now let's talk about the 3rd ingredient, which is the data challenges. So the data challenges. There is a famous saying in statistics that says garbage in, garbage out. This is basically saying that we need to be very careful about what we put into what we feed into the framework, what we feed into the index. Otherwise, we may have the wrong outputs, which in turn may lead to the wrong interpretation. This is basically saying that the data must be available, reliable, and comparable. This is, of course, obvious, and everyone would think the same. However, in the African context, really, are we fighting a losing battle? Can we really say that we can find a rich set of available, reliable, and comparable data set? So before answering this question, I would like to pinpoint some of the issues. In my sense, there are issues that are found in some of the most common indices out there. For example, let me mention this one, the lag effect. So a lot of indices out there, what they do is they take a high number of variables, sometimes hundreds of variables, and they end up using variable at different time periods. So for example, if you're looking to construct a human security index for 2020, you would naturally use variable for 2019. However, not all variables will be available for that year, and you will be forced to go further back and use the data for 2018. You know, while I understand why people do it, it's wrong to mix 2 variables at different time period, and we need to avoid that in our African Human Security Index. We need to synchronize the data to the extent possible. The second point is a lot of people tend to use external indices to construct the African human to construct indices, and this is while it's convenient and may sound appealing, using external indices. By doing so, we import their own sometimes unknown issue to us, and it's very important to have complete control of the construction methodology to have the required confidence in our final numbers. So are we fighting a losing battle? I still haven't answered this question. So I went ahead. I spent the last 4 or 5 days navigating through all 3 databases that I came across. And I have to say, at the Policy Center, we're fortunate. We have a platform called the Learning Center, which centralizes all 3 databases out there. And I would like to thank our database manager for centralizing everything for us. So I spent a lot of time going through pretty much all the databases that came under my hand. The job is not finished, but this is what I found so far. And I found about 30 variables, and I selected here the most recent one, only 2019 onwards. And by doing so, I filtered out 95% of the data I came across, and 95% of the data could not be used for recent index. And I ended up having 30 variables in total. 30 variables in total, it's okay, it's not perfect, but if someone gave me these variables for the last 20 to 30 years, I would start building the index. I will start building proof of concept, and I will start seeing whether there are some important trends that come out of it. We do not need to wait for the data to be perfect to construct a proof of concept. So are we fighting a losing battle? I don't think so. And I join my colleague Eleanor saying that the data is there, it's rich. We just need to avoid the garbage in, garbage out effect and make sure we get the right data at the right place. Okay, great. So I've talked about three things so far. I talked about the framework, I talked about the construction, I talked about the data. And in principle now the index should be constructed by now. However, there is a risk, and there is a risk that the data may not actually fully reflect the situation on the ground. And this is a challenge. So how do we address this challenge? There are many ways to do so. And I'm showing today, I'm showing one possibility, probably the easiest and the most easiest to explain. So first thing first, we can, like Sarah said, we need to get involved the subject matter expert, people who know the situation on the ground. We can allow them to flexibly change the weighting scheme in the index. For example, here is the three representation. We have the 7 dimension from economic all the way to political security. I said earlier that for convenience we can equally weight the dimension. However, we could, this is one possibility, we could introduce an upper bound here and we could introduce a lower bound and give the opportunity to the subject matter expert to slightly tilt the weight of one dimension over the other. Of course, we can only do this only if it's justified. And the reason I introduced an upper bound and lower bound is because we don't want one dimension to be too much over or too much underrepresented in the index. We want to have some safeguards and yet still allow a subject matter expert to overweight, if necessary, to overweight one dimension over the other if the situation on the ground requires it. And of course, by doing so, the variable here, shown in red square, the variables will not be impacted because they have already been geometrically weighted. So I'll finish with some concluding remark. For the index to be practical, interpretability is the key to the African human security usefulness and usability. It needs to be useful and it needs to be usable. Otherwise it's pointless. To be interpretable, we need to have the right framework in place right from the start. We need to have the right mindset to facilitate the end-to-end process, from framework to construction, from data collection, output, and interpretation. We also need to have complete control over the construction methodology to have confidence in the final number. So therefore, I would highly suggest to avoid including external indices in our construction. The other thing that is important to mention is more data does not always mean better information. I would even go and say that more is less. More data introduce more noise and therefore less room for interpretation. Therefore, of course, we need to cherry pick the right amount of variable to construct our index. This is it for me, but since this is a workshop, I would like to leave a question for our audience. So by now, you should all be convinced, or there's no doubt that human security is multidimensional. Health security can of course impact food security because there is a break of supply chain, which in turn can create community stress, which in turn can have an impact on a personal security because of the fear of violence. And in turn, every dimension is actually very dependent to another. So in your opinion, after sitting our presentation, how do you think we should address the dependencies between the different dimensions in the framework? Do you have a suggestion? Do you have an idea? So how do you think we can address those dependencies, based on the framework we have just presented now? Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Saad,
very much. Over to you,
for
Jalal.
this. Thank you, Saad, for this very challenging presentation. I know you've always been emphasizing flexibility and simplicity.
Jalal, I think we
I
can't
fully
hear
understand.
you.
Can you hear me now? I'm on mute.
We still can't hear you.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Can you?
What about now?
Can you activate your mic, please?
Sorry? My mic is on mute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you fine. Perhaps it's something.
Neither you, Eleanor, too. We can't hear you.
Are you sure? Perhaps you've muted the sound. I can hear Jalal. Can other people hear? No? Jalal, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello? Is it the control?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you too. I think there's something with the control.
Okay.
Okay, we can't hear them.
Hello? No?
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So
Jalal,
you can hear me now,
everyone
right?
else can hear us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to saying that thank you, Saad, for this challenging presentation. You have been always emphasizing simplicity and flexibility through all since we started this process. We already have what four questions. How long do we have? Is anybody controlling the time here? Hello?
I think we have until
How many more
2
minutes do we
p.m.
have?
our time. So we have 15 minutes.
Okay, we're having 15 minutes. Briefly, the four questions are: one, about the definition and not agreeable definition about human security. Second, whether the index could be globally, geographically, globally or not. Three, the issue of can we consider technology in this security issue. And then last one is how, I mean, the human security has been criticized for its ambiguous definition, and how can we define the nexus between humanitarianism, development, and security nexus. So I'll just maybe Sarah pick any questions that you want to answer. I just go by first Sarah, then Eleanor, then Saad. Sarah, over to you.
How do you surpass the lack of agreement on the concept and the appropriate data needed to create the African Human Security Index? And this links also to another question, which is about can we consider technology security as a dimension of human security? I mean, I think what I tried to showcase in my presentation, and what I think was supported also by my colleagues, is that the definition of human security is very broad. It is one of its strengths, but it is also its main limitation. I mean, how we can build an index that we can interpret without creating much noise, as it was argued by Saad, is how to keep the index informative. I mean, the human security discourse since the 1990s has kind of opened the Pandora box, I mean, in the good way, in the good sense. It's actually led security studies scholars to look at new factors and different factors that really affect our daily lives, our livelihood, our dignity, our survival. So this has enabled scholars to look at the various dimensions and factors that were not really taken into consideration in the traditional conception of security. And although, let's say, if we take an example as of the effects of climate change on security, although there is still a big debate in the field on whether it's a direct link between climate change and insecurity in some areas, there is still a debate, but I think the approach of human security has at least enabled us to look at various dimensions. Now, for us in this project is building an index, is really how to take into consideration the most serious threats. And this really involves qualitative work and experts' work to really kind of identify the issues that are relevant for each areas, for each regions, and how to translate them into a usable index that can really inform policymakers, inform even investments in certain fields because they would be judged as necessary, and they have effects on various aspects of livelihood. So if it's to answer, can we consider technology security? It would depend on which context. Definitely what the human security approach enables us to do is really to look at all the indicators that can be relevant to build the human security index. So it's a freedom for us as people who are involved in determining what are the priorities, but again, we need to take into consideration what really makes people vulnerable, what is really affecting and has consequences on development and on security in the ground. So I'll let my colleagues also maybe answer this question from another perspective.
Yeah, so the questions on sort of the complexity of human security and the ambiguity of it, I think that's why the index is so important, because as much of a wide concept as it is, it's in order to make improvements and you need to be able to track it, and so it's really important that we find some indicators that do this well, so that policymakers know how to improve people's lives, and that will be part of the challenge of it, is how do we find an indicator that is sort of doing what it should do to measure it on the ground. And I think when the question about also the interrelatedness, I think this is again like why we're gonna spend this time discussing with experts and developing, the 7 pillars into separable indexes. And yes, there will be interrelatedness, and that will be a bit of a challenge of the separation. But then again, that's something that we need to do in order to make it usable, make it user friendly. And I think that there's complexities. We'll be having a lot of discussions about with different experts. With technology, again, yes, this I agree completely. And I think even during COVID, it's also been highlighted the importance of technology. That a lot of us can work from home because of it. And we're very privileged to be able to do so. So that, again, I think will be something that will be discussed and about where it will fit in the pillars. How do we deal? Yeah, and then the poor data issues. Again, this is why this is the point of developing this, also this ideal framework, is that it could also act as a data drive to try and get some better data, and ultimately one day we could actually, figure out all the blanks. And right now we'll just have to, sort of find the best that we can with what's out there at the moment. But yeah, that's the purpose of this sort of ideal model framework, is it's something that as a region we can work towards to one day achieve, and it can act as a drive to get better data. So Saad, I don't know what else you want to add.
Saad?
Thank you, Eleanor. Just to come back to this question is, how do you surpass the lack of agreement on the concept of human security and the appropriate data to create the index? I would say the strength of this project is we have a good combination of experts, subject matter expert and quantitative people. So people, have a lot of experience, and they're not naive. They are definitely aware of the limitation, and that's the reason why we mix in different background to overcome these challenges. And in terms of data, appropriate data or availability of data, we don't have, because everything is interlinked and everything is dependent. We don't need to wait for the perfect data set to construct the index. As Eleanor say, we can put the ideal framework in front of us and build a proof of concept and go from it. Really, sometimes we might be surprised. We might achieve a lot by just having a few data set, few data points that are reliable, as opposed to have a massive data set which is noisy and not really exploitable. So it's not a black and white kind of type of problem. We will work on it, develop a proof of concept, and we will mature over it as we as the project is progressing. Over to you, Jalal.
Thank you, Saad. I think we almost our time with about 2-3 more minutes, and we're very lively debate, even though we have very few participants. But at least the workshop has actually evolved since we met last time in March. I think it shows some progress from my side. See, the index is not measuring an entity or an event. I see the interpretation from the index is to show the African member states the trend that a country is going to. The way the African heads of state made the resolution in Agenda 2063 is they said they want to see a comprehensive human security index that will also show the base for building peace and stability in the continent. So the preoccupation of the African heads of state is how to understand the trend in building peace, the trend in measuring threats, the trend in looking at the risk. This is what they want. We're not like into stock market here where we're measuring the value of a stock or depending on volatility of the market. For us, we're looking at long time horizon, look at available data and make sense of it. Just basically, that's the intention of this exercise. And through time, I believe this will be develop and evolve. With that note, let me say to thank everybody who's there, but I forgot to introduce myself. So I can say my Jalal Abdul Latif, I'm with the UNECA. I'm also non-resident fellow of the Policy Center. With that note, if there is any urgent other question from any participant, otherwise I think we will try to close this session. Okay, well, I would like to say thank you everybody in Morocco, in Rabat. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. I think there is a very interesting session on Global Peace Index. Saad and Sarah, are you presenting or participating there? Just a quick question.
We'll be with the audience.
Okay, all right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you,
you.
Saad. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.